Listen now, as we turn our thoughts back across the long corridors of time, beyond the dust of centuries and the fading of empires, to a small rugged kingdom in the north of Greece, where the mountains lean close and the air is sharp with the scent of pine and stone, and where a boy named Alexander, son of Philip of Macedon and Olympias of Epirus, first opened his eyes upon a world that would one day bear his name in whisper and in legend. A world whose maps would be redrawn by the steel in his hand and the strange bright fire in his mind and heart. A world that did not yet suspect how swiftly its borders would be broken and recast beneath the marching feet of Macedonian phalanxes and the low, thunderous roll of hooves on hard-baked earth. In that early Macedonian world, where the kings claimed descent from Heracles and the old songs spoke of heroes larger than life, Alexander grew as a prince who was never simply a child of privilege but rather a child of expectation and tension for his father Philip. That one-eyed king of sharp intelligence and relentless ambition had transformed Macedon from a precarious frontier kingdom into a formidable military power, drilling his men into a new kind of weapon, a living engine of war made of bronze and discipline and the long, bristling spears they called sarissas, while his mother, Olympias, proud and intense, surrounded herself with sacred serpents and mysteries, telling her son in the quiet hours that his blood was not merely royal, but perhaps something touched by the divine, perhaps watched, perhaps chosen, by gods who still wandered, and seen, across the mountains and through the flickering shadows of palace fires. From his earliest days, Alexander's world was filled with stories, and those stories were not gentle stories of contentment and repose, but tales of Achilles raging on the plains of Troy, of Heracles laboring against monsters and impossible tasks, of Theseus descending into darkness. And the boy, listening with a kind of avid, focused hunger, began to measure himself not against his peers in the palace courtyard, but against these shining, terrible figures of myth, feeling somewhere deep within that life ought to be vast, that a man's span of years was a vessel meant to be filled to the brim with deeds that would echo beyond death, that the horizon was not a boundary but a beckoning finger drawing him outward, farther and farther, to the limits of what could be known, conquered, and transformed. It was into this receptive and restless mind that a certain philosopher from Stagira was invited, a man who had studied in Plato's academy, who had wandered through the subtleties of logic and the wide plains of natural philosophy, who had dissected the workings of the world with the patient, careful attention of one who believed that understanding was the highest form of reverence. This man was Aristotle, and when he came to Macedon, he brought with him not only scrolls and ideas, but an entire way of looking at the world as a coherent, intelligible whole, where causes and purposes could be traced and examined, and where man's place in the order of things could be thought about with a clarity that was almost like a light cast across the confusion of existence. Under Aristotle's guidance, Alexander's days were not spent solely in martial training, though he did practice with spear and sword, and bow until his body moved with the fluid certainty of well-trained instinct. Instead, he also sat in quiet halls or in shaded groves, listening as Aristotle spoke of ethics and politics, of biology and metaphysics, of how city-states rose and fell and of how human beings could aspire to virtue, could balance reason and passion, could seek a kind of measured greatness that did not fling itself into excess. Aristotle spoke of Homer, too, and of tragedy, and Alexander, captivated, is said to have kept a copy of the Iliad close to him throughout his life, sleeping with it beside his bed, treating Achilles not merely as a story, but as a mirror, both a warning and an invitation, a figure of luminous glory and catastrophic rage whose footsteps Alexander might one day follow, perhaps more wisely, perhaps not. Yet while Aristotle's words seeped into his student's mind like clear water into thirsty ground, Philip's court and Philip's campaigns taught Alexander different lessons. Ones written in blood and dust and the clatter of shields, for Philip's rise had not been easy, and it had made many enemies, and Macedon, under his rule, became both admired and feared, forcing its way into the fractious politics of the southern Greek city-states, whose jealousies and rivalries had long kept them from unity. From a young age, Alexander was taken to see these campaigns, to observe the discipline of the phalanx, the swift brutal charge of the companion cavalry, the way strategy could bend a battlefield to the will of one mind. And he learned to ride and to fight and to command with a confidence that bordered, even early on, upon the audacious. There were early signs of the man he would become, the famed taming of the wild horse Bucephalus, enormous and unmanageable, a beast others had given up on as dangerous and unusable. Yet Alexander, noticing that the horse shied at its own shadow, calmly turned its head toward the sun, soothing it with a steady hand and voice, then leaped upon its back and rode, not as a child clinging in fear, but as if he and the animal had been born together for that very union. Philip, watching, is said to have wept and declared that Macedon would be too small for a son of such spirit, that he must seek a kingdom equal to him, and in those words there lay both pride and prophecy, as if the father glimpsed, for a moment, the vast storm that would move across Asia under his son's command. Yet the story of Alexander's ascent cannot be told without the dark, jagged edge of his father's death, a moment as sudden and violent as the thrust of a hidden dagger. For Philip, amid the splendor and tension of a royal wedding at Agia, surrounded by nobles and warriors and the bright, hopeful trappings of celebration, was struck down by one of his own bodyguards, Pausanias, whose motives remained tangled in personal grievance and possible political manipulation. The king fell, and with him the solid, pragmatic hand that had guided Macedon through its dangerous transformation. And in the shock that followed, in the stunned murmur of the assembled crowd, the great machine of the kingdom trembled, its future uncertain, its enemies surely already thinking of revolt and revenge. For Alexander, who was just 20 years old at the time, this was the crucible in which boyhood burned away, leaving behind a figure sharpened by necessity and by a will that had waited impatiently for its hour. He could not, in that moment, lean on the patient reasoning of Aristotle, nor could he indulge the melancholic reveries of Homeric heroes lamenting their fates, because the throne of Macedon, and all that Philip had built, were now prizes that others might try to seize, and hesitation would mean not only his own death, but the unraveling of his father's long, brutal labor among the Greeks. So, he moved swiftly, with a decisiveness that to some would seem ruthless, even cold, and yet which, from another angle, was simply the logic of survival in a court and a world where power was always edged with violence. Potential rivals among the nobility were eliminated, some by the sword and some by more subtle means, and rumors whispered that Olympias herself dealt with some of Philip's other wives and children, smoothing the path for her son with a ferocity that matched his own. In the cities of Greece, where resentment of Macedonian dominance simmered just beneath the surface, stirrings of rebellion arose at the news of Philip's death, in Athens and in Thebes and elsewhere, men imagining that the death of the father would mean the collapse of Macedonian authority and the return of old freedoms. Alexander, understanding instinctively that he must display not only strength but also speed, marched south with his army, his presence a moving answer to those who doubted his resolve. And he stood before the Greeks, young yet already radiating that intense, focused energy that so many would later describe, a charisma that combined charm and danger, promise and threat. He insisted that the agreements made with Philip would stand, that he would continue to lead the crusade that had already been conceived against the old Persian enemy across the sea. A crusade proclaimed under the banner of avenging the ancient sacrilege of Xerxes' burning of Greek temples and cities, but also, of course, carrying within it the tantalizing prospect of wealth and glory on a scale hard to fully imagine from the hills and valleys of Greece. Still, not everyone accepted his authority, and Thebes in particular, bold and proud, misjudged the young king, thinking perhaps that his youth would mean hesitancy, that Macedon would fracture without Philip's steady hand. What followed was swift and terrible. Alexander marched on Thebes, ringed it with his forces, and in the assault that came, the city was taken and then punished so harshly that Its fate would echo like a warning through all of Greece. Its walls were broken, much of its population sold into slavery, and only the house of the poet Pindar was said to be spared. Out of respect for the cultural memory he embodied. It was an act that revealed the steel beneath Alexander's cultivated image of the heroic prince. And from that moment, the other Greek cities, shuddering at Thebes' destruction, were more inclined to bow before him, to accept his leadership of the Corinthian League, and to let him turn their pent-up energies outward, toward the long-hated empire of Persia. Thus, when Alexander at last stood upon the shores of the Hellespont, that narrow strait of water that separated Europe from Asia, he was no longer simply the son of Philip, no longer only the student of Aristotle, but the commander of a united, or at least subdued, Greece, and the spearhead of a grand campaign presented as both a revenge and a liberation. A mission to free the Greek cities under Persian rule and to strike at the heart of an empire that had once. In a symbolic gesture that would be retold again and again, Alexander is said to have cast a spear from his ship onto the Asian shore, claiming the land of Asia as a gift of the gods. Something that he would not merely visit or raid, but own. He also went to Troy, to the windswept plain where Homer had set the struggles of Greeks and Trojans beneath the watchful eyes of capricious gods, and there, in a quiet, reverent act that fused myth with reality, he sacrificed at the supposed tomb of Achilles, honoring the dead hero whose name and deeds had infused his imagination from childhood. And it is as if, in that moment, he stepped not only across a geographical boundary, but into the storyline of epic itself, determined to write, with real blood and real suffering, emulate it across the expanse of the Persian world. But the gods of Asia did not yield easily to this young intruder, and neither did the satraps and generals of Darius III, the Persian great king, whose empire, though fraying somewhat at its edges, still stretched over immense distances, from the Aegean shores deep into the heartlands of Mesopotamia and beyond. Almost as soon as Alexander crossed, he was confronted by a Persian force near the river Granicus, in the rugged lands of Asia Minor, where the waters moved cold and swift over stones, and where the banks would soon be churned into mud by the clash of men and horses. The Battle of the Granicus was both a test and a declaration, for if Alexander failed there, his grand campaign would end almost as soon as it began, and he would be remembered, if at all, as a reckless youth who had overreached. Yet he chose, in a characteristically bold manner, to attack across the river itself, leading his cavalry through the swirling, chest-deep water, while Persian horsemen lined the far bank, their arrows and javelins whizzing through the air like deadly and seen insects. His men struggled to keep their footing, shields held high. And for a moment the whole endeavor seemed like madness, a folly born of overconfidence, as the strong current and the opposition combined to shove them back. But Alexander, in gleaming armor, with his plumed helmet catching the sun and his companions clustered around him, pressed on, refusing to retreat, and in that stubborn, audacious advance, the morale of his troops was lifted even as the Persians began to sense that they were facing something unusual, something that would not be easily turned aside. The Macedonians gained the far bank, formed their lines even amid the chaos of the river's edge, and began to push uphill, their long spears creating a grim, advancing forest of steel, in the melee that followed. Alexander narrowly escaped death when a Persian noble raised his sword against him, only to be slain by Cletus the Black, one of Alexander's loyal officers, whose intervention would be remembered later with bitter irony. By the time the sun dipped lower and the cries of battle faded into the sighing wind, the Persian forces had been broken, many of their leaders slain, and the path into Asia Minor had been violently pried open. The victory at Granicus was not only a tactical success, it sent ripples of fear and doubt through the Persian satrapies, encouraging some cities to open their gates to Alexander, while others, sensing the gathering storm, began to reinforce their walls and stockpile supplies. As the Macedonian army moved along the coast, taking one city after another, Alexander took care to present himself not as a mere conqueror, but as a liberator of Greek communities long subject to Persian rule, restoring their autonomy or at least promising more favorable conditions, and in doing so, he wrapped his campaign in a cloak of legitimacy that appealed to the Greek sense of pride and vengeance, even as it masked the deeper, more personal drive that beat within his chest, the drive to go farther, always farther. Yet Persia was not defeated, and Darius could not ignore this young king who had suddenly burst into his western territories. A larger, more carefully assembled Persian army confronted Alexander near the town of Issus, where narrow coastal plains squeezed between mountains and sea forced both sides into a constricted, brutal engagement, the great mass of the Persian host unable to fully deploy its numerical advantage in that cramped, wind-swept space. Darius himself was present this time, seated in a splendid chariot, surrounded by the symbols of his authority, his royal insignia gleaming, his standards fluttering, as if to remind all who looked upon him that he was, in theory, the ruler of lands stretching beyond the horizon. For Alexander, Issus offered both danger and opportunity. To defeat the great king himself would be to tear at the very fabric of Persian prestige, yet the narrowness of the field, with a river slicing through it and rough ground constricting movement, meant that the battle would likely devolve into a series of desperate, intimate fights, where armor scraped against armor and men killed at arm's length. Feeling the resistance of flesh and bone beneath their weapons, the air would fill with the metallic scent of blood, the harsh reek of sweat and fear, the cries of the wounded mingling with the shouted commands, and above it all, the unceasing rattle of saurisses and the rumble of chariot wheels biting into the packed earth. Alexander, deploying his phalanx at the center and his cavalry on the right, advanced with calculated aggression, aiming once again at what he perceived as the critical point, the position of Darius himself, the symbolic heart of the Persian line, while his infantry met the brunt of the Persian attack, absorbing and returning the pressure in a grinding contest of ranks and shields. Alexander led a decisive cavalry charge that cut through the Persian flank, wheeling inwards like a scythe toward the great king's position, as the Macedonian king drew nearer. As the glint of his armor and the relentless forward motion of his troops bore down upon Darius, a tremor of fear, or perhaps simply a calculation of survival, passed through the Persian leader, and he turned his chariot and fled the field, his departure seen by many of his soldiers, who in that moment felt their courage falter and their cohesion dissolve. The rout that followed was savage. Persian soldiers, suddenly leaderless, tried to escape through the narrow passes and along the rocky coastline. But the geography that had once constrained their enemy now became their own trap. And the waters of the sea, calm and indifferent, received the bodies of those who slipped or were driven into its cold embrace. In the aftermath, Alexander found among the Persian camp the mother, wife, and children of Darius, who had been left behind in the panic of flight. And here, in a gesture that would be often remarked upon, he treated them with respect and courtesy, reassuring them that Darius still lived, that their honor would be preserved, and that they would not be harmed. For Alexander understood not only the harsh language of war, but also the subtle, persuasive language of magnanimity, which could soften resistance and lure hearts into admiration or at least reluctant acceptance. Issus was a turning point, but the empire of Persia did not collapse in a single blow, and Alexander, gazing eastward, knew that to secure what he had won, he must first strip the Persians of their naval and coastal power in the eastern Mediterranean. For as long as Persian fleets could move along the coast, there would be a threat to his communications, to his supply lines, and to his prestige. Thus he made the strategic decision to march south along the Levantine coast, through the lands that had known the touch of Egyptian and Assyrian and Babylonian and Persian rulers, lands where cities clung to the sea's edge like barnacles to a rock, each with its own history, its own gods, its own pride. Most of these cities, feeling the wind shift, chose to open their gates to accommodate this new power from the north, recognizing that resistance would likely bring ruin. But one city, rich and fortified and proud above all others, refused to submit. Tyre, the great Phoenician island city, rising from the blue waters not far from the mainland, Walled and defiant, its harbors busy, merchants wealthy, its traditions old and deep, Tyre was not merely a place of stone and commerce, but a symbol. A stubborn outcrop of independence that would not generously hand its neck to any conqueror's yoke. And so when Alexander sent envoys demanding entry and the recognition of his authority, they were rebuffed, their requests politely but firmly declined. To this refusal, Alexander responded not with resignation, but with one of the most extraordinary feats of siegecraft in the ancient world. An enterprise that would test his patience and the endurance of his men, but which, once completed, would stand as a testament to his relentless refusal to accept limitations. For if Tyre would not come to him, he would, in a sense, make the land itself move toward Tyre by constructing a massive causeway, or mole, stretching out from the mainland toward the island. A colossal tongue of earth and rubble and timber pushing slowly across the shallow sea. As Macedonian soldiers and laborers hauled stones, felled trees, and dumped them into the water under a rain of arrows and stones from Tyrian defenses. The months that followed were filled with the creak of siege engines, the hiss of torches, the splash of waves against the growing causeway, whose spine advanced relentlessly but whose workmen were constantly harried by Tyrian ships and by sudden sorties from the city's defenders. Alexander brought in ships of his own, creating a counter-fleet, and the siege turned into a complex dance of rams and towers and boarding parties, of fires kindled and extinguished, of walls battered and rebuilt. The island city, which must have once felt secure in its maritime distance, now saw, day by exhausting day, the mainland drawing nearer, until at last the Macedonian engines could be brought up to batter its walls. And after roughly 7 bitter months, the defenses cracked, and Alexander's soldiers poured in, the air filling with smoke and screams and the terrible finality of conquest. Tyre's fall was brutal. Many of its inhabitants were killed or sold into slavery, and its stubborn pride was repaid in iron and flame. But its defeat meant that the eastern Mediterranean coastline, that shimmering interface of land and sea along which armies and ideas and goods had moved for centuries, was increasingly under Alexander's control. From Phoenicia he moved not only further south, but also inward, his reputation by now a kind of advance guard outrunning his physical movements, so that cities weighed their options, balancing the honor of resistance against the very real possibility of annihilation. And many chose to yield. At last, his path led him to Egypt, the ancient land of the Nile, where the great river poured its life-giving waters into a broad, fertile valley before spreading into a labyrinth of channels and reeds at its delta, where temples rose with their hieroglyphic-encrusted walls and colossal statues, and where pharaohs had been buried beneath the heavy stillness of pyramids while the stars slowly wheeled overhead. Egypt had long been under Persian domination, resenting foreign rule that did not speak the ritual language of the Nile gods, and as Alexander entered, he was greeted not as a conqueror bringing yet another alien yoke, but as a liberator, one who would lift the Persian burden and restore a sense of autonomy and sacred continuity. In this land, older than the stories of Greece and Macedon, Alexander moved with a kind of respectful curiosity. He traveled to Memphis, made sacrifices to the Egyptian deities, and allowed, or perhaps encouraged, the local priesthood to proclaim him pharaoh, weaving his identity into the living fabric of Egyptian kingship, which connected the ruler not only to the people, but to the very cycles of nature and divine order. By accepting this role, he did more than pin another title to his name. He began to experiment with a larger idea of kingship, one that could adapt itself to the expectations of different cultures, that could present him as both Greek hegemon and Eastern monarch, as both warrior and semi-divine figure, straddling the worlds he wished to unite. One of the most emblematic acts of his time in Egypt was his journey into the Libyan desert to consult the oracle of Amenet-Suwa, a sanctuary of an ancient god whom the Greeks associated with Zeus. The journey itself, across shimmering sands and under a sky of pitiless blue, must have been harsh and disorienting, the heat pressing down like a hand, the silence of the dunes broken only by the soft crunch of sandals and hooves, and in that austere environment, Alexander sought not strategy or practical counsel, but something more elusive, confirmation, perhaps, of his extraordinary destiny. A divine ratification of the path he was carving across the world. What precisely the oracle said to him remains shrouded in ambiguity and later embellishment, but the rumors that filtered out suggested that he was addressed as the son of Ammon, that his birth and mission were cloaked now in the sacred language of divine filiation. Whether fully believed or cleverly used, this suggestion of divine parentage would become a subtle, powerful thread in how Alexander presented himself and was perceived, especially in the East, where the separation between mortal and godlike ruler was often less rigid than in the cities of Greece. Yet Alexander's time in Egypt was not only about sacred journeys and oracular whispers, it was also about the very tangible, practical act of founding a city. One that would endure far beyond his brief life and stand as a permanent stone memory of his presence at the crossroads of Africa and the Mediterranean. On the edge of the Nile Delta, where the river's final branches surrender their fresh water to the salty vastness of the sea, he chose a site for a new city that would bear his name, Alexandria. There, on a stretch of coast washed by the bright, restless waves, with the sound of water always in the background like a low, continuous murmur, he laid out, or had his planners lay out, a rational grid of streets, a designed space where Greek institutions, Egyptian traditions, and the commerce of many peoples would one day mingle. Alexandria, in conception, was more than a naval base or a trading hub. It was an idea made stone, a deliberate planting of Hellenic culture on foreign shores, intended to serve as a beacon and a bridge. A place where the Greek language would be spoken in markets filled with Egyptian grain, where scholars might one day gather in libraries heavy with papyrus scrolls, where the rhythms of Greek drama and philosophy would meet the ancient theology of the Nile. And founding it, Alexander shifted, in some subtle way, from being merely a destroyer of old orders to a founder of new ones. A man whose conquests were beginning to generate new cities, new syntheses, new patterns of life that would ripple outward long after the last of his soldiers had returned home or fallen on distant fields. Thus, as he turned his gaze once more eastward, toward the heartlands of Persia, Alexander was no longer simply the king of Macedon who had crossed the Hellespont with a daring plan. He was now also the avenger of old Greek wrongs at Issus, the stormer of impregnable Tyre, the pharaoh of Egypt, the beloved of Ammon, and the founder of Alexandria, a shining seed of the future planted in the rich coastal soil. His identity, like his empire, was already expanding, layering itself with roles and symbols drawn from the many cultures he had touched. Even as the dust of Asia Minor still clung to his sandals, and the taste of the Mediterranean wind still lingered on his lips. Ahead of him lay the great royal road to Babylon, to Susa, to Persepolis, and beyond that, the unknown landscapes of Central Asia and India, where the maps of his own geographers grew vague and speculative, and where the very edge of the world seemed to beckon like a hazy, radiant boundary between the known and the unimaginable. And in his heart, the restless flame that had been kindled in Macedon and fanned by Aristotle's words and Philip's ambitions and Homer's verses burned ever brighter, urging him not to rest among his new titles and new cities, but to keep moving, to chase the receding horizon of conquest and to see, with his own eyes, how far the earth might stretch beneath the wheel of his chariot and the hooves of Bucephalus, and what kind of story a single human life could inscribe upon the wide, patient face of the world. And so we return to Alexander at the height of his young power, pausing only briefly amid the quiet courtyards and sunlit colonnades of Egypt, where the slow, eternal breathing of the Nile might have invited a lesser man to rest and rule in comfort. Yet where for him the tranquil rhythm of the river was not a lullaby but a backdrop, a soft murmur against which the louder call of destiny still sounded in his ears, insistent and irresistible, drawing his gaze back toward the rising sun, toward the deep interior of the Persian world where Darius III still reigned in title, if not in unshaken confidence, and where the final decision between the two men and the two visions of empire they carried within them still awaited its moment on the open field. From Egypt, Alexander moved steadily northeast, threading his way through the lands that fanned out between the eastern Mediterranean and the northern fringes of the Arabian Desert. Following ancient routes that had carried caravans and armies and envoys since forgotten centuries. The air often dry and tasting of sand and stone, the horizon shimmering under the heat. While at night the stars burned sharp and close, as if watching with a kind of cold curiosity as this restless Macedonian king passed beneath them with his tightly organized, battle-seasoned host. There were cities that opened their gates as he approached, cities that hesitated and then yielded, and stretches of wilderness where the only sounds were the crunch of marching boots and the low murmur of soldiers' voices drifting across the dark like smoke from a hidden fire. Darius, for his part, was not idle in these months. Stunned but not shattered by Isis, he gathered his strength, sending envoys to the far corners of his realm, calling on satraps and subject peoples to send men, horses, and chariots to a new, great army. One that would dwarf the forces he had previously put into the field, an army that would assemble on the flat, open lands near the village of Gaugamela in northern Mesopotamia, where the terrain, carefully chosen and even cleared of irregularities, would allow the full deployment of cavalry and the swift Scythe chariots whose spinning blades at their wheels were meant to tear through enemy lines like iron harvesters through a grain field. Darius trusted in the sheer weight of numbers and in the psychological pressure of his royal presence amid that immense host, and he expected, perhaps, that Alexander, though brave and cunning, would finally be swallowed up by the magnitude of Persian power once it was properly displayed. As Alexander advanced into Mesopotamia, the landscape around him began to change, the air growing thicker with heat, the light bright and almost metallic as it glanced off the waters of the great rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, whose broad, glinting surfaces nourished fields and cities that had been ancient even when Homeric songs were first sung in Greece. Here the soil was rich, the horizon punctuated by canals and groves of date palms, and by the distinctive silhouettes of ziggurats and city walls rising from the flatness like man-made islands. The dust kicked up by his army mingled with an older dust, the residue of Assyrian and Babylonian campaigns, as if every footfall stirred not only the present, but the layered memory of countless forgotten wars. Near the village of Gaugamela, Darius awaited him with an army whose size made even hardened Macedonian veterans draw quiet breath, for as they crested low hills or looked out across the plain, they would have seen not a compact, coherent force like their own, but a great, wide sea of men and horses, a shimmering expanse of spears and standards, the bright flash of metal armor sprinkled across the landscape like shards of sun on water. Persian cavalry filled the wings, their banners snapping in the wind, while at the center, surrounded by chosen guards, Darius' chariot stood as the radiant focal point of the host, its presence a statement that this day would decide not some provincial skirmish, but the very question of who would be master of Asia. The night before the battle, we might imagine Alexander walking among his men, the campfires flickering low, the murmurs of soldiers rising and falling as they spoke in hushed tones of home, of past battles, of the morrow's dangers. The cool night breeze carrying faint scents of smoke and dry earth. The sky overhead a dark bowl spangled with stars. Perhaps he paused to speak with his officers, to review plans sketched in dust by firelight, lines and arrows traced by calloused fingers, shifting here to account for terrain, there to anticipate a possible flanking move by the massed Persian horse. Perhaps he stepped away, for a moment, to look out toward the unseen, but sensed immensity of the Persian camp, its faint glow on the horizon like a dull, red stain at the edge of night, and felt within himself that familiar mingling of excitement and somber responsibility, of the intoxicating anticipation of risk and the gravity of knowing that thousands of lives would soon pivot on his decisions. Dawn came slowly to Gaugamela, the first pale light edging the eastern horizon, washing over the plain and turning dew to a brief shimmer before the heat drank it away. The Macedonians stood in their accustomed formations, the phalanx at the center with its forest of psoriasis angled forward, shields overlapping, helmets glinting, while the companion cavalry clustered around Alexander on the right, their horses stamping, breath trailing in faint white puffs in the coolness of early morning, and scouts reported the positioning of the Persian troops, noting with concern the long, extended wings of cavalry that threatened to envelop their smaller force, and the chariots, their blade-tipped axles ready to slice through infantry if they could gain speed and space. Alexander, absorbing these details with a mind trained by years of campaigning and by the theoretical frameworks of Aristotle's lessons in cause and effect, adjusted his lines with deliberate care, refusing to stand as a static block to be surrounded, instead fashioning a slightly angled formation that could stretch toward one side. Drawing the Persian cavalry out and creating gaps, he placed reserves with an eye to the unpredictable, knowing that in battle, plans often met reality in a sudden, jarring collision, and that victory would depend not only on his initial dispositions, but on his ability to react swiftly to shifting tides of movement and morale. When at last the moment came and the armies began to move, the quiet of the plain was shattered by the deep, hurling thunder of thousands of feet and hooves, by the sharp, staccato clatter of chariot wheels, by the low, rising roar of voices commands shouted, war cries let loose, prayers muttered under breath. The Persian Scythe chariots surged forward, their drivers urging the horses to full speed, the blades at their sides whirring menacingly. On the wings, the Persian cavalry pressed hard, seeking to overwhelm Alexander's flank and to crow around behind his center, and for a time the Macedonians bent under the pressure, dust swirling into choking clouds around the struggling masses of men and animals. The air thick with the grunts and cries of combat, the clash of steel on bronze, the wet, ugly sounds of wounds being opened, but this outward stretch of the Persian line, this attempt to enwrap, also created, as Alexander had anticipated, a thinning near the center, a subtle weakness, an exploitable gap between Darius' position and his left wing. Seizing this fleeting opportunity, Alexander led his companion cavalry in a wedge formation, a sharpened spear of men and horses driving forward with relentless, focused energy, the hooves drumming the earth like a war drum, his own figure at the point, easily seen by both friend and foe, urging them on. The charge cut into the Persian line at an angle, tearing open that vulnerable seam, and suddenly the great king, who had been encircled by layers of protection, found that the Macedonian arrow of force was aiming straight at him, its penetrating tip cleaving ever nearer through the chaos. As at Issus, the moment of personal danger proved decisive for Persian morale. Darius, confronted again with the terrifying proximity of Alexander's charge and perhaps recalling the rout of that early battle, chose or felt compelled to turn and flee the field in his chariot, his departure visible to surrounding troops who, seeing the royal standard recede, felt the strength go out of their limbs as if some invisible cord had been cut, and what had been disciplined resistance dissolved into a desperate scramble for survival. The vast army that had been arrayed so impressively under the morning sun now came apart in dust and confusion, Macedonian cavalry pursuing where they could, infantry advancing steadily. And the field of Gaugamela, by afternoon, belonged to Alexander. In the aftermath of this decisive victory, the political and psychological foundations of the Achaemenid Empire cracked irreparably, for though many satrapies and cities remained to be taken, the symbolic heart of Persian kingship had been fatally struck. Alexander proclaimed himself Lord of Asia, and as he moved deeper into Mesopotamia, cities like the legendary Babylon opened their gates to him, not as they once had to conquering Assyrian or Persian kings, but now to a foreigner whose name had spread like the shadow of a swiftly passing cloud from the shores of the Hellespont to the banks of these ancient rivers. Babylon, with its massive walls and sprawling palaces, its hanging gardens rumored to be among the wonders of the world, its temples dedicated to gods whose names tasted strange on Greek tongues, received Alexander with ceremony and curiosity. He entered the city not as a mere plunderer, but as a ruler mindful of Babylon's prestige, walking beneath its processional ways, accepting the homage of priests and nobles, allowing its religious structures to continue, letting the machinery of its administration remain largely intact. as if to demonstrate that his conquest was not the annihilation of all that was, but a reorientation of power, a redirecting of loyalties from the distant, now vanquished Darius to himself. From Babylon he moved to Susa, another royal center, rich with treasures accumulated over generations of Persian rule, and then onward to Persepolis, the ceremonial capital whose grand terraces and audience halls had been built to embody the grandeur of Achaemenid kingship. There, amid the splendor of carved reliefs showing delegations from every corner of the empire bringing tribute, Alexander found both the material wealth of Persia and the symbolic heart of its self-image, and it was there, in an act that has been debated and interpreted in countless ways, that he allowed the palace complex to be burned, the flames rising into the clear air, sending a twisting pillar of smoke and sparks into the sky as columns cracked and roofs sagged, the ornaments of kings melting and collapsing in the inferno. Some said he did this as a deliberate gesture of revenge for Xerxes' burning of Athens long ago, repaying in kind the sacrilege inflicted on Greek temples, a theatrical, satisfying symmetry of destruction. Others later claimed it was a drunken, impulsive act, urged on by companions and by a courtesan who plucked at his pride and his sense of grievance, and that he regretted it afterward, recognizing that he had destroyed a monument not only of Persian power, but of human craftsmanship and history itself, whatever the true blend of motives and emotions. The burning of Persepolis stands as a moment when Alexander, already beginning to think of himself as heir to the Asian throne, nonetheless enacted with fire the final symbolic downfall of the old Persian order. Darius, fugitively moving through his own empire, attempted still to rally resistance, but he was at last betrayed and killed by one of his own satraps, Bessus, in the remote regions of Bactria. His royal corpse left for Alexander to find and honor. When Alexander came upon the dead great king, he is said to have covered him with his own cloak, lamenting that he had not been able to confront him alive once more. To fully enact the ritual of conquest by taking him captive, he ordered Darius buried with royal dignity, and then, in a gesture at once pragmatic and symbolic, pursued Bessus as a rebel and regicide, punishing him and claiming, through this righteous vengeance, a kind of moral and legal continuity with the Achaemenid kings, as if to say that he was not the destroyer of Persian monarchy, but its legitimate successor. Yet conquest, like appetite, grows with its indulgence, and Alexander, having taken the central trunk of the Persian Empire, now turned his attention to the far-flung branches in Central Asia, in Bactria and Sogdia, where rugged mountains and harsh plateaus waited, and where local rulers and tribes were far less inclined to surrender simply because some distant capital had fallen. The land here grew more forbidding, the air thinner and colder in the high passes, the winters sharp, the summers blazing, and the terrain broken into jagged ranges and valleys where resistance could hide and strike and melt away again like shadows at dusk. As he led his army into these regions, the neat contours of familiar battles on open fields gave way to the grinding frustrations of guerrilla warfare, of sudden ambushes and elusive enemies who knew every fold of the hills, who could vanish into the rocks and then reappear where least expected. Macedonian soldiers, who had marched so far already, found themselves building fortresses in remote, lonely places, garrisoning them to hold down recalcitrant populations, crossing icy rivers, struggling along narrow mountain paths where a misstep could mean a fall into roaring gorges below. Heat cold biting at their fingers and faces, their breath puffing in pale clouds while their heavy armor felt more like a burden than a badge of honor. Alexander himself did not shrink from these hardships. If anything, his energy seemed only to intensify, as if the difficulty of the campaign fed his inner furnace, compelling him to ever more daring maneuvers, to forced marches that pushed men and horses to the edge of endurance, to bold assaults on high crags where fortified strongholds perched like eagles' nests, their defenders hurling stones and arrows down upon the climbing attackers. In one such assault, Upon a fortress in Sogdia, Alexander's men scaled near vertical cliffs with tent pegs and ropes, appearing at dawn on the heights above, as shocking proof to the defenders that no place was truly beyond his reach. And they surrendered in disbelief, having learned that even the sky-facing rocks could not fully shield them from his determination. It was in these harsh eastern lands that Alexander's policy toward conquered peoples began to shift from simple replacement of rulers to more complex and, to his Macedonians, sometimes troubling experiments in integration and fusion. He married Roxana, a Bactrian noblewoman of striking beauty, not only out of personal attraction but also as a gesture tying him to the local aristocracy, creating bonds of kinship that might soften resistance. He adopted elements of Persian dress and court ceremony, wearing robes and a diadem in the Eastern style, and expecting certain rituals of obeisance from visitors and courtiers, including, controversially, the practice of proskynesis, in which one prostrated oneself before the king in a gesture that in Persian tradition had powerful, layered meanings of respect and recognition of semi-divine status. For Alexander, such customs might have seemed natural adaptations to the expectations of his new Eastern subjects, a necessary step for a ruler who now claimed oversight of a vast, culturally diverse empire stretching from the Aegean to the fringes of India. But for many of his Macedonian companions, raised in a rougher, more egalitarian warrior tradition where the king was first among comrades, rather than an untouchable being set far above them, these changes were unsettling, even offensive. They saw their king surrounded increasingly by Persian courtiers, heard him speak of fusing Macedonians and Persians into a single, ruling class, and watched as he arranged the training and arming of Persian youth in the Macedonian style, creating new units that, in time, might stand beside or even replace the old phalanx that had carried him to victory. Tensions brewed beneath the surface of these grand experiments in cultural fusion, and sometimes they exploded into open conflict. The most tragic and telling of such clashes was the quarrel with Cletus the Black, the very man who had once saved Alexander's life at the Granicus, a seasoned officer who had fought under Philip and who cherished the rough camaraderie of earlier days. A banquet in Sogdia, fueled by wine and by underlying resentments, Cletus sharply criticized Alexander's adoption of Persian customs and his apparent disdain for his father's legacy, accusing him of forgetting the men and traditions that had made him great. Alexander, his temper ignited and stoked by drink and by the festering sense that he was not fully understood in his grander, more universal ambitions, responded with harsh words, and in a sudden, disastrous flash of rage, seized a spear and killed Cletus with his own hand. The stunned silence that followed that fatal blow must have been heavy as stone, the faces of those present pale in the flickering torchlight, the air thick with the sour scent of spilled wine and the sharp, metallic tang of fresh blood. Almost immediately, Alexander was overcome with horror and remorse, recognizing not only the personal loss of a friend and comrade, but the symbolic weight of the act he, the would-be unifier of nations and heir of heroes, had slain in a drunken fury a man who had once interposed himself between the king and death. He is said to have shut himself away, refusing food, grieving in a raw, inconsolable way that suggests he felt, in that moment, the terrifying possibility of a crack within himself, fissure between the image of the just, magnanimous ruler he sought to project and the dark, destructive capacities that lay coiled in his nature. And yet, even this did not halt his march. After a time, he emerged again, subdued but still driven, his mind turning now from the cold uplands of Central Asia toward the warmer, more humid lands that lay to the southeast, where the Indus River and its tributaries threaded through forests and fields, and where kingdoms unknown to the Greeks awaited, their rulers perhaps only faintly aware, if at all, of the storm that approached from beyond the mountains. Alexander's imagination, fed since youth by tales of the world's limits, of lands where strange beasts roamed and where the ocean encircled all, was drawn powerfully toward India. which to him represented both a geographical frontier and a kind of metaphysical edge. A place where the known world might at last fall away into the great surrounding sea. The march into India took the Macedonian army through the Khyber Pass and other difficult routes, where narrow defiles and steep cliffs loomed on either side, where the air grew warmer and thicker, the light softer but more oppressive, and where the scent of unfamiliar vegetation, broadleaf plants, damp soil, distant flowering trees began to mingle with the familiar odors of leather and bronze and sweat. Monsoon rains lashed the landscape, turning roads into sucking mud, swelling rivers into dangerous torrents, soaking armor until it felt like an added weight upon already burdened shoulders. And the constant humidity settled into men's lungs and bones, an invisible, clinging presence that sapped strength and patience. Despite these hardships, Alexander pressed forward, engaging and overcoming local rulers, crossing rivers that seemed to him and his men like living, surging obstacles whose currents tugged at their legs and tried to tear loose their footing. The water sometimes swirling around the bodies of men and horses who had misjudged its depth or force. Near the Hydaspes River, he encountered King Porus, tall and imposing Indian ruler whose army included, to the amazement of the Greeks, war elephants, massive, trumpeting beasts, their tusks sheathed in armor, their backs bearing towers from which archers and javelin throwers could rain death upon those below. At the Battle of the Hydaspes, fought in rain and mud, with the river at their backs and the elephants looming before them, Alexander's men confronted both the physical terror of these unfamiliar animals and the sheer fatigue of years of campaigning. Yet their discipline and the flexibility of their tactics carried them through. Skirmishers and archers targeted the elephants' drivers and sensitive points. Cavalry maneuvers disrupted the supporting troops, and slowly, through courage and methodical aggression, the Indian line began to falter. Porus himself, wounded yet unbroken, refused to flee. And when brought before Alexander after the battle, he answered the Macedonians' question, "How would you like to be treated?" with the simple, dignified reply, "Like a king," a response that so impressed Alexander that he restored Porus to his throne, enlarged his kingdom, and turned a former enemy into a trusted ally, recognizing in him a kindred spirit of royal pride and tenacity. Yet each new victory in India was like a stone added to the burdens carried by Alexander's troops, who had now been away from their homes for many years, their ranks thinned by death and disease, their bodies scarred, their minds weighted with memories of comrades left beneath foreign soil, their eyes tired of seeing always new horizons instead of the familiar lines of Macedonian hills. As they pressed deeper into the subcontinent, the rains grew heavier, the forests denser, the rumors of even larger and stronger kingdoms farther east more frequent, and Alexander, fired by an almost insatiable desire to go on, began to speak not merely of conquering all of India, but of reaching, at last, the outer ocean that he believed encircled the world. It was here, on the banks of the Hyphasis River known today as the Bees, that the long pent-up resistance of his army finally found its voice. Called together, the men, through their spokesman, made clear that they would not go further, that their strength and will had limits, that they wished to see their families again, to enjoy the fruits of all they had already achieved. Instead of chasing ever more distant, undefined goals, the Hyphasis flowed broad and brown before them, its far bank veiled in mist and rain, as if the land beyond did not wish to reveal itself, and the murmuring sound of its waters might have sounded, to some, like an echo of their own restless longing for an end. Alexander, hearing their refusal, was torn between fury and understanding. This was the one battlefield where his charisma and authority, which had bent so many cities and kings to his will, met an obstacle that could not be overcome by a charge or a clever maneuver. For it lay within the hearts of his own soldiers, in their weariness and love for home. He withdrew to his tent, brooding, perhaps pacing in the dim light, the sound of the rain soft on the canvas above, wrestling with his pride and his dreams, with the image of himself as a world conqueror who would drink from the waters of the encircling ocean, and with the stark reality that no king, however great, marches alone. He must be followed, and those followers were at the limits of their endurance. At last, in a gesture that might have been both painful and wise, he emerged and announced that they would go no further, that the will of the army must be respected, that the hyphasis would mark the easternmost boundary of their march. He offered sacrifices, as if to acknowledge to the gods and to himself that some doors would remain closed, that even the greatest of human plans must sometimes bow before circumstances. Monuments were set up, altars raised, and then the army, turning at last from its long eastward path, began the journey back. Not by the same route, but in a vast, looping arc that would take part of the force down the Indus and then through the searing deserts of Gadroja, a march that would itself become a new ordeal. That return through Gadroja, across lands of blistering heat and shifting sands, where water holes were few and treacherous, where the sun beat down from a cloudless vault and the sand itself seemed to burn the feet, claimed more lives than many of Alexander's battles. Men collapsed under the blazing sky, lips cracked, tongues swollen, armor and weapons suddenly monstrous weights, and the line of march became a long trail of suffering figures staggering through a landscape stripped of mercy, the wind carrying away their cries and leaving only the faint hiss of sand in its wake. Alexander, sharing in the hardships as much as he could, is said at one point to have had a helmet of precious water brought to him only to pour it out before his men, preferring to endure thirst with them rather than drink alone, a gesture that bound them to him even as they cursed the path they were on. By the time they emerged from that cruel expanse, the army was a ghost of its former self, worn and diminished, its veterans aged beyond their years, its younger recruits hardened and haunted, and ahead of them, like a mirage that slowly took on solid form, lay again the familiar but now irrevocably changed world of Mesopotamia, where Babylon, with its broad streets and lush gardens, waited to receive its wandering conquering king once more. Alexander entered that city not as the raw, fiercely eager youth who had crossed the Hellespont, but as a man tempered by victories and losses, by experiments in governance and personal tragedies, by the knowledge of his own powers and the shadowy awareness of his own inner fractures. In Babylon, the air hung heavy and warm, scented with incense and river moisture. The light filtered through dust motes that danced lazily in palace halls. And Alexander began to turn his thoughts more fully toward the future of what he had created, toward the difficult and intricate question of how to govern and hold together this vast, diverse empire that stretched from Greece and Egypt through Persia and into the edges of India. He envisioned new campaigns, perhaps toward Arabia, perhaps even beyond, but he also considered the structures that would outlast his own restless presence, the cities he had founded or refounded, the new satrapies administered by a mixture of Macedonian and local elites, the training of young Persians in Macedonian military ways, the arranged marriages between his officers and noblewomen, of these such as those orchestrated at Susa, where a mass wedding bound many of his companions into family ties with Persian houses. These measures to Alexander's mind were the beginnings of a new blended aristocracy and culture, a Hellenistic world where Greek language and ideas would mingle with Persian and Egyptian and other traditions, creating something fresh and dynamic. But to many of his Macedonian veterans, the Susa marriages, the elevation of Persians in the army, the continued use of Eastern court protocols, felt like a dilution of their hard-won primacy, a betrayal of the simpler, rougher, more familiar order they had known under Philip, and grumblings persisted, even as they obeyed his commands and accepted the honors and lands he distributed. Alexander moved through his Babylonian palace with the slightly restless tread of one who, though weary, cannot easily be still. He held councils, issued decrees, reviewed troops, received embassies from distant lands now eager to be known to him, and perhaps, in quieter hours, he walked alone in gardens where water trickled from fountains and palms rustled softly, the thick, perfumed air a contrast to the sharp winds of Macedon and the dry, high cold of Bactria. He was not yet 33, yet he carried on his shoulders the weight of an empire and of a legend already forming around him. And in the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, in the tighter set of his mouth, one might have read the strain of sustaining a life lived entirely at a pitch of such intensity Then, in the early summer of 323 BC, within those very palace walls that had seen so many kings and ceremonies, Alexander fell ill. Accounts differ in their particulars. Some speak of a fever that came on after a prolonged banquet and libations to the gods, others of a sudden, sharp pain, as if something within had been fatally wounded. But what is generally agreed is that his strength ebbed over several days, his body racked by heat and weakness, his voice growing faint, even as his mind by some accounts remained lucid, thinking still of armies and roads and the vast tapestry of lands he meant to weave more tightly together under his guiding hand. As he lay upon his bed, unable to rise, his commanders and companions gathered around, anxious, disbelieving that this tireless, seemingly unstoppable man could be brought low by an invisible enemy, by some nameless sickness, or perhaps by an old wound now festering, or, as some speculated, in the fearful murmurs that always accompany great men's deaths by poison. The palace, usually buzzing with activity, grew hushed, its corridors filled with whispers, the sounds of idles on stone muffled, as if the building itself held its breath. When his officers asked to whom he left his vast empire, Alexander, according to one version, replied simply, "To the strongest," a phrase that, if indeed he spoke it, was both a recognition of the brutal realities of power and a kind of resignation to the chaos that would almost certainly follow, for without a clear, designated heir of age and authority, the immense structure he had erected through effort and blood and brilliance would be pulled at by many hands, its unity contested, its future uncertain. He is also said to have given instructions that his body be carried, not to Macedon, but to the land of Egypt, where he would ultimately be interred in Alexandria, the city he had founded beside the sea. As if in death, as in life, he wished to stand at the crossroads of continents and cultures. On the day he finally succumbed, Babylon, with all its ancient stones and statues, with its rustling gardens and humming markets, fell into a stillness, as if the sun itself had paused above the horizon. The man who had crossed the Hellespont as a young king with a small but fierce army, who had shattered the Persian hosts at Issus and Gaugamela, who had stood in the sands of Siwa and been hailed as the son of Ammon, who had renamed cities, raised others from the dust, and driven his men through mountains and monsoons to the banks of the Hyphasis, was now a silent, cooling form upon a bed, his breath no longer misting the warm air, his eyes closed to the lands that had burned so brightly in his imagination. In the years and decades that followed, his generals, the Diadochi, tore at his empire like wolves at a carcass, carving out kingdoms in Macedon, Egypt, and Asia, fighting, betraying, allying, and fighting again, while his posthumous son and half-brother, fragile pawns in the great game, were swept aside, the unified empire he had envisioned fractured into successor states. Yet even in that fragmentation, something of his grand experiment endured, for the cities he had founded, most notably Alexandria in Egypt, but also others scattered across the Near East and Central Asia, became centers of Greek language, thought, and art, hubs where Hellenic culture interwove with local traditions to produce new forms in philosophy, science, religion, and everyday life. This Hellenistic world, born from the turbulent wake of Alexander's conquests, saw Greek become a lingua franca from the Mediterranean coast to the fringes of India, facilitating exchanges of ideas and knowledge. In Alexandria, the great library gathered texts from across the known world, scholars dissected the workings of the human body and the cosmos, and new schools of thought, Stoicism, Epicureanism, and others grappled with questions of how to live in a world suddenly much larger, more complex, and more cosmopolitan than the tight city-states of classical Greece had known. The markets and workshops and temples of these lands one might have heard mingling in the air spoken Greek alongside Egyptian, Aramaic, and other tongues, the clatter of coins bearing the images of kings whose legitimacy was traced, however tenuously, back to Alexander. Local religions encountered Greek gods, and sometimes they melded Zeus with Ammon, for instance, or various Eastern deities with Hellenic counterparts, creating syncretic cults that reflected the hybrid nature of the New Age. Artistic styles blended, with Greek realism meeting Eastern symbolism to carve statues and paint images that carried a double heritage. In the distant region of Gandhara, Greek influence would shape the earliest anthropomorphic depictions of the Buddha, giving the serene sage of India a Hellenistic cloak and a face with features carved in the style of Greek sculpture, a silent testimony in stone to the far-reaching, unexpected cultural consequences of one Macedonian king's march. And in the centuries to come, as Rome rose and absorbed many of these Hellenistic realms, as new empires and religions, including Christianity and later Islam, reshaped the map of the lands Alexander had once crossed, his memory did not fade. It was retold in histories and legends, in romances that transformed him into a seeker of marvels, a visitor to the depths of the sea and the heights of the sky, a king who conversed with strange peoples at the ends of the earth, a figure around whom fantasies of universal conquest and exploration could be woven. In the medieval Islamic world, he appeared as Dhul-Qarnayn, the two-horned one, a quasi-mythical figure associated with justice and boundary-making, while in Europe, he remained a symbol of heroic ambition, both admired and warned against. Scholars, statesmen, generals, and dreamers would look back upon his life, some seeing in him a model of visionary leadership and courage, of the power of a single human will and intellect to reshape the world. Others seeing a cautionary tale of overreach, of a man driven by insatiable desire for glory, whose very success sowed the seeds of later chaos and suffering, whose conquests cost innumerable lives and uprooted established ways of life. Both views, in their own ways, contain truth, for Alexander was neither a simple hero nor a simple villain, but a complex, driven, flawed, and extraordinary human being, in whom the capacities for generosity and brutality, for brilliance and self-destructs, for empathy and egoism, coexisted and shifted as his circumstances and inner tensions evolved. If we stand in our minds once more upon the windswept shore of the Hellespont, watching that young king cast his spear upon the Asian soil, and then fast forward our imagination to the heavy, scented air of Babylon where he breathed his last, we can trace the arc of a life that, though brief, carved a deep channel through history, altering the courses of many rivers of culture and power. We can sense, too, in the dust of old roads and the ruins of forgotten cities, in the quiet lapping of waves against the stones of Alexandria's harbor, in the faint echo of Sarissus clashing and chariot wheels rumbling, that the world he reshaped still bears, in subtle ways, the impress of his restless passage. And perhaps, listening closely, in the soft whisper of desert winds moving across the ruins of Persepolis, in the gentle rustle of palm fronds in Mesopotamia, in the murmuring of the Nile as it flows past old temples and modern banks, one might almost hear, beneath the sounds of our own age, the fading yet persistent resonance of marching feet and shouted commands, of ambitions spoken and unspoken, of the quiet, inward voice of a man who, having been told as a boy that his father would leave him no great deeds to accomplish, resolved to prove that no boundary geographical, cultural, or even, in his dreams, divine could fully contain his yearning. For even now, when we speak his name Alexander the Great, we invoke not just a historical figure, but a cluster of questions about power and possibility, about the cost of greatness and the lure of empire, about whether it is better to seek a life of measured peace or to hurl oneself against the limits of the world in the hope of leaving behind an echo that will endure. And in that invocation, in the soft-spoken retelling of his march from Macedon to the edges of India and back to Babylon, we also acknowledge that the dust he once kicked up has long since settled, that new empires have risen and fallen upon it, and that what endures as faint and persistent as the stars that watched him pass is the layered shimmering legacy of a man whose story once begun could not be easily contained within the simple borders of any one land or age.